Your Highness, good morning. We have today our friends from India participating. These are eminent scientists and researchers who we have for the first time been able to cordially invite, and they have accepted our invitation to participate in this. You will also meet them on Saturday, more depth. So today we're going to move on to the idea.
Usually I describe myself as a messenger of ancient Indian thought. So now my real master, these are my
This morning we're gonna be looking into the effects and influence that emotions play on attention and the memory. And we are very honored that Professor Elizabeth Phelps is coming from the University of New York. She's there at the Department of Psychology and Neural Science, and her work has been groundbreaking in the investigation of how the human brain processes emotion and how that particularly affects learning, memory, and decision-making. So please, Liz, it's yours.
Thank you. So, Your Holiness, before we begin, I want to say it's an honor to be able to participate in this dialogue with you today. And I want to thank you in advance for your attention and consideration. So I'm going to talk to you today about emotion and its impact on attention and memory. And just to give you a brief outline, I'm going to start just talking a little bit, very briefly, about what emotion is and why we have emotion. Then I'm going to move on to talk about emotion and its influence on attention, and then emotion and its influence on memory. And at the very end, I'll talk a little bit about how our thoughts can influence our emotions and how this might relate back to memory and attention. So I've heard a lot in this meeting so far about the destructive nature of emotion. But emotion also has some very important functions that are necessary for human survival. So in this picture here, as you can see, the fear this woman feels will motivate her to take actions to protect herself. And here's an example of a young mother looking at her infant, and the joy and love that she feels may inspire her to care for this child when it's difficult. So emotion is a signal. It tells us what's potentially relevant or important, and this can help motivate us to take appropriate actions. And because emotion is so important in how we function in the world, it should, by definition, influence our attention, memory, and our thoughts. If we look at the brain, it seems to be designed to do just this. So I'm going to talk today quite a bit about this region right here in red. It's called the amygdala. And this slide here shows a diagram of connections throughout the brain. And what this part here looks like is somewhat like, I come from the island of Manhattan in New York. This looks a little bit like Grand Central Station, which is our main train station. The amygdala is widely connected to a number of regions throughout the brain. And in a way, this allows the amygdala, when something emotional comes along, it allows the amygdala to influence the rest of the brain, to change our thoughts, our attention, and our memory. I'm going to talk today about how the amygdala does just that. So before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about what affective scientists think of when they think of emotion. Now, I think you and I and others in this room could talk for an hour or a day or maybe a month about what emotion is. I'd like to postpone that conversation until the discussion section, if we could. I just want to tell you that affective scientists, people like me who study emotion, know emotion is not one thing. There are a number of parts of an emotional response, and so I'm just going to briefly review what some of those aspects are. So usually when we use the term emotion, we're talking about our subjective feeling, what we think, how our consciousness is feeling at that time. And that's part of emotion, but it's just one component of emotion. When we have an emotional response, our body also responds. We can, for instance, increase our heart rate. We might sweat a little bit. Stress hormones will run through our body. We will also express this emotion in our face or our voice, for instance. And the emotion will motivate us to take particular actions, perhaps to approach something or withdraw from something. And another very important component of emotion, which I'm going to get to a little bit more later, is this notion of appraisal. To initiate an emotion, we have to evaluate the situation, interpret the situation, and that helps us determine what the right emotional response should be in that circumstance.
Emotion 개발이야. 그 자와 가다 개인 체험도 걸 개인들은 고튼 배고네. 휴지좀 가서 제고도 emotion 레컨데스틸 개고도 그 저다로 제고 가다 저바로 제고 그래서 evaluation 된다는 말도 그러지만.
So I'm going to move on right now to talk about emotion and attention, the first topic that I want to cover. I'm going to make 2 points in this section. The first, emotion has two distinct roles in attention, modulating attention. One is it aids attention and perception for emotional events. At the same time, these emotional events capture our attention, so it's harder for us to observe and attend to non-emotional events. So I'm going to give you just a little example of the first function of emotion and attention. So this is from yesterday's tea break. And as you can see, Sonia is engaged in a conversation with Cliff. Myla is talking to Sonia. Now Sonia is close to Cliff, and if she chose to, she could hear what Cliff is saying. Instead, she is using her attention to focus on what Myla is saying in this noisy room. And that's what attention does. It helps us select some things to pay attention to and other things to ignore because they're not relevant. If, however, Cliff were to start to say something about Sonia, she might hear her name, even though she's trying to ignore Cliff. She can't ignore something relevant coming through.
미국의 모란게시스 때에 여자 남자 코들이야 나만 샤샤 그래서 다양 깨지시베 쇼를 모란가 민 반항원 깨지시베 나는 모란민 된서나 모란다 되어요 엔자랑 싱들이야 더나 지그레스 the emotionally important 차고르와 the murder to the 되어요 엔자.
So in this way, emotion, something that's emotional and meaningful to us, will break through our limited attentional resources, even when we're not trying to pay attention to it. In the laboratory, we study this effect with something with the attentional blink, which you heard about from Anne Treisman. So again, the way this paradigm works is a number of stimuli, in this case they're words, are presented very quickly. And we ask people, in this case, to tell us the words that are in green ink and ignore the ones that are in black ink. And people are pretty good at doing this, unless this second word, what we call the second target word, comes very soon after the first target word. When this happens, people often miss the second target word. And that's because noticing this word and encoding this word and attending to this word takes some resources, which are then limited.
experiment 제가 그리야 lab 나 미술이 이 지디에 방진 된제 다 지금 나 보임 받을이야 칸 라모고스 전에 장구유나 니 칸을 납쇼아스 다 하우스 라보라 다 니버디 니 양랑 부샤베나 미술 람투고레스 다 니버디 랩세디 니 강바다 강베시드다 니버로 지키용베나 니야 랍투고요 말레스. So in terms of time, temporal distance, how much?
So this is about 300, 400 milliseconds, and here we're looking at 500, 700 milliseconds.
The second 지 동부동도 하실 담배 숨자 차 숨자 납자 도와. 근데 난그 가족이와 라베네. So is this simply because of the attentional blink factor?
Yeah, this is the attentional blink effect. Okay. Yes, this is the same thing.
Nothing to do with the emotive content of the word.
No, it has nothing to do with the word, except what we did in this case was sometimes the second word was an emotional word, as in the word rape, and sometimes it was a neutral word. So when we did that, what we found was a pattern like this. So here is when there are neutral words. You often miss the second word, in the early leg period, a little bit late when it comes later, a little bit less when it comes later on. When it's, however, an emotional word, and it could be negative or positive, what we see is we do better.
안에 책디 그 수수대 두도 되고 싶은 부여든 얘기 용조 싶은 게 도에 책인데나 그걸로선 주투년시다 다 다가스 즉 로마denk 책 소리인데나 주모토에.
And this is very similar to the pattern that Anne Treisman showed you with meditation. So here, just changing the emotional quality of the words instead of meditation has the same impact on the attentional blank. Okay. This is with patients with damage to the amygdala, that brain region that I showed you earlier in red. What you see is here, this is the percent of times they reported the second target word. There was no difference if the word was neutral or emotional. They failed to show this enhanced response on the intentional blink effect with damage to the amygdala. So this tells us the amygdala mediates this facilitation of attention with emotion. And when we think about how this happens, we know something about the amygdala's connectivity with the rest of the brain. So the amygdala, this region back here, is the visual cortex. And the amygdala gets information from the visual cortex very quickly and early on in sensory processing. It then feeds information back to the visual cortex, telling the visual cortex if something is emotionally significant. So if you show somebody faces with a fear expression, you will see enhanced amygdala activation. You will also see enhanced activation in early regions of the visual cortex. And if you damage the amygdala, you fail to see more amygdala activation in the visual cortex. What's interesting about this is this response we see that depends on the amygdala in the visual cortex for emotional faces occurs even in these regions in the very back that we know are necessary for simple perceptual functions. So I'm now going to demonstrate for you a simple perceptual function called contrast. I'm going to show you a little circle, and there are going to be some lines in the circle, and they're going to be tilted to the right or the left. And I would like to know if they're tilted to the right or the left. We'll ask Diego to answer. Very good. How about this one?
Right.
Good. How about that one?
Confused?
Okay.
No, it's left. Yeah.
It's left, you can see. It's very hard to see on this one on the bottom. And the reason is...
Take the yellow shorter, you know, short. That's every time I do.
Now it's clear.
You know, short. Take two.
Yep.
Here.
Two.
Can you see?
I think the screen is very small because, you know.
Yeah.
Well, I tried to make it hard, so don't feel bad if you can't see. The point I wanted to make with this, these patches vary in what we call contrast, which is the differentiation between the light and the dark shades. And contrast is a perceptual function that happens very early in visual processing. You need contrast to even detect lines. And we wanted to see... So given that we know that emotion affects processing, even in these very early visual areas, we wanted to see, does emotion influence our ability to pick up on very subtle perceptual cues like contrast? So we did an experiment, something like this. Participants looked at a cross on the screen, then they were flashed a face, and then a patch like this, and they had to tell us, are the lines tilted to the right or to the left? And we varied across trials both the emotional qualities of the face. It was either a face that had a fear expression or a face with a neutral expression, and the amount of contrast in the patches that we showed. And we determined by doing this over a number of trials how much contrast the participants needed to be able to detect the orientation of the lines when it was preceded by a fearful face or a neutral face.
No.
And what we found was something like this. When one of these patches was preceded by a fearful face, you needed much less contrast to be able to detect the orientations of the line than when it was preceded by a neutral face.
Emotion drama. 그 part 톰비 겐신.
그런 좀 받아 두고. 근데 그게 버그 동bat들이야. 그 용조 담에 되는 남주 통고. 뉴트럴 페이스다, 샤나랑베 페이스다. 디 통년 정원에서 그래. 근데 반항모디 용조 수준부 옆에 동바지나 디 통배 겐제제. 아니 디 까나 임제 틱도 세버시라면은 문제 제도여지.
So this tells us that perhaps the reason emotion aids attention, it's easier for us to pick up on emotional events when our attentional resources are limited, is because it's actually easier to perceive events that are in the context of emotional situations.
attention resource 무치라줄 때고 그거다 용소식 친구들 대화 요대비 된다 중앙 강의버데 수수디둘 그때가 대화 요더니 진짜 어느 코단 대화 요나 남사 미버 숙친부 때 권인식 랑신 용요르슬랑.
All right, so emotion aids attention and perception for emotional events. We think because the amygdala influences sensory brain regions to ease the processing of these events. I now want to move on to the second effect of emotion on attention, which is that emotion captures our attention, making it harder now to process events that are not emotional. I'm going to start again giving you an example. So I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but this has happened to me. I'm driving somewhere, usually it's on a weekend, and I want to get there, like the beach, someplace like that. And there's a lot of traffic, and I'm in a traffic jam. And you spend a while in the traffic jam, and eventually you get to where the traffic jam starts. And when you get there, you realize the reason there's a traffic jam is because there's a car accident. But the car accident is actually not blocking the lanes on your side of the road. The car accident's on the other side of the road. But the reason why your side of the road is slow is because everyone's stopping to look or slowing down to look at the car accident. So, of course, when this happens, you get annoyed at everybody ahead of you who was slowing down to look at the car accident, but then, of course, you slow down as well to look at the car accident. This is an example of emotion capturing attention. In the laboratory, we will use paradigms like this to look at the effect of emotion capturing attention. You're going to see a dot on either side of the cross. And the task here is simply to press a button as quickly as possible on the same side that the dot appears. Immediately before seeing the dot, however, I present faces like that. So in this case, the dot came on the same side as a fearful face. In this case, the dot came on the same side as a neutral face. We'll also see a similar effect if I have faces of babies versus faces of adults. And in this case, the dot came on the opposite side of the face of the baby. And what we see in this case is that when we have an emotional face, people press the button much faster when the dot appears behind the emotional face than when it appears behind the neutral face. The reason this seems to happen is because the emotional face, even though they aren't told to look at the faces at all, captures your attention. And it becomes harder now to look away at the dot on the other side. This experiment has been done with brain imaging studies, and what we find is that a region of the brain here, the parietal lobe, now you heard about this region from both Anne and Amishi. So if you remember, Anne told you about a patient who ignored half of the space, half of visual space. That patient had damage to the parietal lobe. What this part of the brain does is it helps us move our attention. And if you have damage to this brain region, it's hard to move your attention to the opposite side of space. The amygdala doesn't just connect to the visual cortex, it also connects to the parietal lobe. And when we have an emotional stimulus that comes, we have less activation in this region, in the parietal lobe, which then makes it harder for us to move away, to look at something else when there's something emotional in front of us. So emotion captures attention, impairing our ability to process non-emotional events. And that brain regions that help us move our attention among events are less active when an emotional event is encountered.
Makes sense, yeah.
Okay.
Emotion 처음 들으셔요.
So he's always asking the question, how do you actually define emotion.
So in this case, so something about the amygdala that's very interesting, and as I mentioned earlier, we can talk about how you define emotion for hours. So maybe, no, but I want to answer this particular question because I would like to talk about this. I just want to be able to finish the rest of the talk. But the amygdala is not a region that seems to be necessary for your feeling. It actually seems to be a region that responds in the presence of something emotional that then sends a signal out to let you, the rest of the brain, determine, is this important? So the feeling may come after that. So in this case, of course, you probably didn't have a strong emotional response in seeing those faces. But those faces are a signal that something's potentially important. You don't know yet whether it is important. But because it's potentially important, the brain should now pay more attention to that to determine if it really is important and something that is necessary to elicit a whole emotional response.
The amygdala is strong emotion 용해를 대서 못해봐 숙침부여 말이스. 대인에 다간다 지 emotion that 되어야 되니까 다 수수대도 팬도 내가 되어 유든이 그 중원을 보잖아. 다 뒤에고 개짐으로 잡고 되거나 뒤 문제 지낸다.
아니 emotion 랑디도 저래.
나
emotion 랑디도 저래. 현지도리야. emotion
So for example, like if the amygdala is signaling something emotionally relevant, important event, does that necessarily imply that it is important to you, to the person who's experiencing, or can't one have emotion with relation to someone else that is completely other focused, like say altruism or compassion?
Sure, absolutely. So
so that may not be relevant to the survival or the well-being of the individual.
Person. Yeah. No.
So it is not self-focused, or it's not self-directed.
It doesn't have to be self-focused, but you decide what's relevant to you. So if it is important to you, to be altruistic or compassionate, that still is relevant to you. Okay. So I want to now move on to emotion and memory, to talk about how emotion might influence our memories. And here I'm going to be talking about long-term declarative memory, the memories that we have for days or weeks or years. And before I get into what emotion does to memory, I want to talk a little bit about the structure of memory. So memory really has 3 stages. The first stage we call encoding, and this is when you first...
So can you explain encoding?
Yes. This is when we first encounter information. So this is just the first time I see you, I'm encoding a memory of you. So this is just when we first encounter information. Once we've encountered information, we store the memory. This is a passive stage because we aren't doing anything. It is just in our minds and our brains, waiting for the next stage, which is retrieval. So emotion can influence. So retrieval is simply when we now recall the memories later. We want to bring them back to mind. So emotion can influence all 3 stages of memory independently. So I'm going to go through them one by one. I'm not going to say much about the first stage because essentially the first stage, what happens in encoding that influences memory, is the same thing that happens with attention. The more we pay attention to something, the more likely we are to remember it later. So I've already told you what emotion does to attention. What it does is it gives us enhanced processing for the highly emotional events and impaired processing for the other events that are around. So for instance, in this situation, you probably are hardly noticing the architecture of this building.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So emotions' influence on encoding are the same as attention, which is It allows us a better ability to take in information that's central and emotionally important, and less of an ability to take in information that isn't as important. Storage. So storage to you and me seems like a very passive process. However, we know in the brain it's not so passive. There are changes that are happening in the brain over time that make memories become more or less stable. So a lot of the things that we encounter, we forget. But some of the things we don't. If you were to, for instance, bump your head and have a concussion, what might happen is you might forget some things that happened right beforehand. And this is because this storage process of memory was interrupted. So there's a period of time after you encounter something where the memory becomes set in your mind. And this is a storage process we call consolidation. Emotion influences this storage process. So in an experiment we did, we showed people pictures like this, sort of neutral scenes of people interacting. And later on, they were shown pictures like this again, and other pictures, ones they have seen before, ones they haven't seen before. And we asked them both immediately after they saw the pictures, and then also a week later, did you see these pictures before or did you not? And what we saw for the neutral pictures was a pattern that you might expect. Immediately, when we asked them, they remembered quite a few of the pictures. When we waited a week, however, they forgot quite a few. This happens all the time in memory. We forget things over time. We also included pictures that were highly emotional, like this one. Here, what we saw immediately, they also were very good at remembering which pictures they'd seen before. However, they didn't forget the pictures at the same rate. They seemed to hold on to them a little bit more strongly.
No.
We know this is because of the interaction of the amygdala here in red and this yellow region here called the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is a part of the brain that's very important for memory overall. If you have damage to this part of the brain, you won't remember almost anything. You wouldn't remember 5 minutes from now that we had this conversation, or a day. What we know happens when you encounter events here, they have to be events that are highly arousing, because this effect is completely due to the stress hormones that occur when you encounter an emotional event. The amygdala responds to these hormones, and it influences the storage processes in this region, the hippocampus. And this is why memories that are highly emotional are retained over time.
Stress hormone 중심 release 되게네 명화데 템페날이야 때문에 하루지. 지고르스.
Okay. All right. So emotion enhances memory storage. Emotion also has an impact on this final stage of memory, which is when we recall it. So you probably remember where you were when you heard about the attacks of 9/11. Most people have fairly vivid memories of that day. So memory is not just coming up with information again, but when you come up with this information, it has a quality to it. It can have a sense of vividness, it can have a sense of detail. You can feel like you're recollecting it as if you're reliving the experience. Or it can just seem like something that happened before. It can seem somewhat familiar, but you don't really remember all the details. Memories for highly emotional events like this one are usually recollected with a strong sense of vividness, a sense of confidence that the memory is right and it has detail.
근데 되게 또 용서 축침부 용데 이게 템버티기디 템베가블이야 템버 세고 싶으시 망jel이야 14고 싶지 이게 무슨 용거에서 나오고 시작했어.
Okay. So what's somewhat surprising about studies that have looked at memories for events like 9/11 is that even though individuals have this strong sense of vividness and confidence that their memories are right, they're not always so right in all the details. So let me give you an example of an experiment that was done. A day after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, students were brought into the laboratory and they were asked to write down what happened when they heard about the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and also to write down another event that had occurred that day or the day before. So for instance, if they'd gotten together with some friends to study for an exam, they might recall their study section. So the day after 9/11, they were asked to describe the events in detail for the terrorist attacks and the study session they had with their friends. A year later, they were brought back.
라 말해 근데 September 11 중배 상이대 상이대 로루가시 수공 콘솔이야 다 디갑데 디비던 디통백갑데 수수 초가 가르쳐 온 수제지 가르가르 제바세지 정말 티르주 대단한 볼이야 야고 용소도 대바 숙지모 매대비 차업 가르쳐요네 배는 고수 부구수 년보 좀제 랑종 제거든 제요나 디기야 내주디 가르가르 제바세 티르주 대디냐제 로직이 쉬고 아니 야 깨도 군도 티빈서리 so you know.
A year later, they were brought back to the laboratory and they were asked to write down their recollections of both the events of 9/11 and the study session. What they found was the memories for 9/11, although they were accurate in the details for what had happened that day in terms of the terrorist attack, they were no more accurate in the other details. So for instance, where they were, who they heard it from, than memories for the study section. Both of the memories for details declined over time for both types of memories.
그 중요한 것이 대 통보다 되게 됐다. 제가 대 14번 걸려 수선의 퇴중 디비나 응고스 통중에 되게 14번 봐. 되게 아니 대 랑종 제베 그 템버지다 군인이 시시다 개발면도 14번간 내주고.
So what differed between the memories for the study section and for 9/11 was that the subjects were highly confident that their details for the 9/11 memories were correct. It's very hard to convince somebody that they're wrong about what they recollect that day. But nevertheless, their details were not correct. For the other memories, they weren't confident in the details. It seemed like a distant memory, and they didn't have any confidence that they were correct about what they were saying. So this tells us that emotion increases our confidence in our memory accuracy, perhaps even more than it increases our memory accuracy. So if we want to think about why this is the case, we can look at the brain to give us some hints.
말하다 지단 가다 템버디 다가랑 중벌에서 지금 네 시에도 왔었네. 이지도 숙제. 그때는 14부터 템버이 미쳐봤다면도. 용조다 대화 숙지면 매든 얘기 템버디게 되니 제마 템버가버야디 이나면에서 지수중원에 대좀다. 디 이지도 숙지면 매체 용조 다부 유니기 템버들이야. 이지 숙지면 쉬시다디 다가랑 뒤딱다 다가랑 중성수. 네 세브 탱크도 수수 템버들 수수 이지 숙지면.
Okay. So first let's think about why this might be the case. So if you remember, when we see something highly emotional like this, what we do is we focus on it, so we encode this aspect of the memory very well. And because it's highly arousing, we store it better. So we have a very strong memory for the central important details that occurred that day. What we don't have is a strong memory for all these other details that occurred that day. We did an imaging study where we put people in the scanner and we asked them to recall their memories of 9/11. And we also asked them to recall memories of other life events that had occurred. So here's an example of a few of the memories. And these were all people, so New York University is fairly close to the World Trade Center. So these were all people that experienced it that day. And so these were some of the memories. So one person said, the explosion caused everyone in the area to automatically duck for cover. I saw some scaffolding that I could go under to avoid the falling debris. Another person said, I saw with my own eyes the towers burning in red flames, noises and cries of people. The other events that came up from their life were things like a birthday party or perhaps moving to New York for the very first time. When we compared memories for the recollections of 9/11 versus the other life events, we found greater activation in the amygdala and less activation in the parahippocampus, which Anne talked about yesterday. So let me go into this a little bit more.
So can you explain the significance of this?
Yes,
now?
I will.
Yeah.
So if you remember, the amygdala I talked about is a brain region that allows us to focus the attention and then stores that memory strongly. So this tells us when people are coming up with these memories, they're giving us very strong memories for these details. The parahippocampus, this is a region that Anne spoke about. It's right here in blue, that Anne spoke about in her talk. And if you remember, when people were looking at houses, they saw activation in the parahippocampus. This is a region, they call it a place area. So it actually is important in encoding a lot of details of the context of what's occurring. And the fact that they have less activation of this region suggests they have less memory for the details of the context when they're recalling these memories. So we're seeing a trade-off. So you actually are saying, I'm highly confident in the memories, in its details, but you're saying that because what you have is a very strong memory for a few central details and actually worse memory for all of the details of the context.
강보다 내가 한다 사진을 통배걸이야 야 액티베이션 요걸 대해서 레벨 차시 주마 오늘 들으셔 다들 9/11기 템버디
다 세부 그저도 뭐 그저도 인체 가래
세부 그저부터 이믹들라체 아믹들라 대체 뭐 보였을 베라히포캠퍼스한테 고유한테 보여베 레벨 차시 그간다 9/11 대체배걸이야 중앙무시들이야 템버 세부 시부체 고유다 예용이 좀들이야 이 템버 Yeah. So these are different localities in the brain.
Yes. So the place where we see the increase is here, and the place where we see the decrease is here. And this is a region we know that's important when you encounter potentially important events that allows us to focus attention and store those details, those important details more strongly. This is a region that we know is important in encoding a lot of details of the scene. And so what we think is happening here is that your very strong memories for a few details is misleading you to think that you have a strong memory for all of the details when perhaps you actually don't. So what I've told you about emotion and memory is that emotion enhances the storage of events, so that the amygdala here actually influences the hippocampus to make sure that events are stored better over time, and that it increases confidence in memory accuracy more than accuracy. So we may not actually remember all the details of the emotional events, but sometimes we think we do. And you might wonder why this is the case. Why would we have a system of memory where we don't actually remember the details, but actually we think we do? And if we think about what memory does, memory is a guide from the past to help us act in the future. And when something's highly emotional, it's probably important that we remember that emotional event, but not so important that we remember the details. And the confidence you have in your memory helps you be sure about your memory. And so in an emotional situation, you may want to act quickly. You may not want to have to question whether your memory is correct, even if it's detailed, because probably if it's highly emotional, the details aren't what's so important.
Emotion memory,
So the implication here is that if the memory is not that of a strongly emotional kind of content, then there will be greater accuracy in remembering the details. Is that the implication?
So sometimes there's greater accuracy in the details for neutral events. Often, what you find is not much of a difference in the details for the neutral and emotional events, but people think the details are better for the emotional events.
지난 갑가실이야 간다 emotion 중심부 맵에 템버도 있나 detail des 사버 시버 용시 그래서 이내 개발 가려서 라베나 디테일이야 니 편준이가 템버 세버 매네 emotion 중심부 유니기 중원들이야 details 되게 다가란 인삼삼지 이제 죽셔요 그래서 강사 템버 수준 거네 되게 다모란 내가 들으지 템버 수준 건 이제 지금 용거 좀 생각해서나 마음 발이야 대단하라고 riktyun chebe na lamsan tonglen che ku yorba. Ta di angsa yongya tundalya. Yeah, that makes sense.
The truth is, over time, we usually forget most of the details of neutral events anyways. So, all right, I want to now move on to the final part of my talk, which is to talk about the relationship between thoughts and emotion. So our thoughts play an important role in generating emotion. And here I'm getting back to what I hinted at the very beginning, this notion of appraisal. How we interpret an event or evaluate an event is important in the emotional response that we have. And I'm also going to suggest that our thoughts can both increase and decrease our brain's response to emotional events. But just to give you an example of the relationship between thoughts and emotion, as you can see, here we have two cats looking at the same dog. This cat, however, sees this as a mean, potentially threatening dog. This cat, however, sees this as a perhaps playful dog that could be its friend. Now, why these two cats have different interpretations of the dog, I don't know. It could be that this cat had a bad experience with the dog in the past and this cat didn't. Perhaps this cat was born being somewhat more fearful than this cat. Perhaps this cat has a meditative practice and this one does not. But the point I want to make here is that how we think about something can change the emotional response we have. And this is true both in our behavior and in our brain. So this gets back to the term appraisal that we talk about in emotion research. Anytime we encounter something, we have to say, is this relevant to me in this circumstance, or how am I going to make this relevant to me in this circumstance? And we have a choice here in what we do. And this just isn't how this doesn't just apply to our feelings, but also to our brain's response to emotional events. So this is one way that we show how thoughts can increase your brain's response to emotional events. So this is the type of experiment we do in the laboratory. We bring people in, we show them something neutral, like a blue square. And then we do something that's not very nice. We give them a little shock to the wrist. It doesn't hurt too much. It's a little electric shock, yes.
Shock test,
Yeah.
law test. Then the experiment, that's shock takers.
I promise you it's not so bad.
So can you describe? Yeah.
The shock?
No. Can you just how what happens afterwards?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
What happens afterwards?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So what happens is, initially they see the blue square and they get a mild shock to the wrist. And when they get the mild shock, they get a little nervous. That's what these little dots here, that's sweating. And eventually, they just have to see the blue square. And they start to sweat a little bit. So they learn that the blue square predicts that they might get a shock. This is simple Pavlovian conditioning, much the way Pavlov described with a bell ringing and a dog getting food. You have this automatic body response to something fearful, which is a little bit of sweating. And now the blue square by itself, because it was paired with a shock, elicits that same emotional response. What's interesting is I don't have to actually give you a shock to have the blue square elicit an emotional response. I can just tell you that when you see a blue square, you might get a shock. I never actually have to give you a shock. And the emotional response that I see in the participants looks almost identical. So in this case, what you have is no direct experience. You have this symbolic conceptual knowledge of the relationship between the blue square and the shock. When I look at the brain in both of these circumstances, so here's what I see. Here's the amygdala here. And here's what I see when they're looking at the blue square that was paired with shock. Here's what I see. Here's the amygdala here. And here's what I see when I tell them that the blue square means you might get a shock. The brain looks almost identical in these two circumstances. And this tells you how our thoughts can generate emotional responses much in the same way actual aversive experience can. We can also diminish our emotional response. So doing something very similar. Now, again, in this experiment, we pair a blue square with a shock. We also have another stimulus here, a yellow square that never gets paired with shock. On some trials, I asked participants just to attend to their natural feelings when they see the blue square or they see the yellow square. On other trials, before they see the blue or the yellow square, I asked them now to regulate to try to think about it differently, to change their emotional response. And the way we do this is before we do the experiment, we say, when you see the blue square, and I ask you now to regulate your emotional response, I want you to try to use that color to think of an image for you that's calming, an image from nature. So now, instead of, when you see the word regular, instead of thinking about the fact that you might get a shock, think about this image that you came up with that's calming to you. And this is what I see. So here what I've plotted, this is essentially a measure of your skin that tells me subtle differences in sweating. And here's the amount of sweating you have to the blue square that means you might get a shock, and the yellow square that means you won't get a shock. When I'm asking you now to just attend to your natural feelings or try to regulate your emotional response. And we see we don't get much.
ngombu tofchi tembe kable ya show yung gres la char ba sebu tofchi tembe kable show zan yo mares tati tangbone la ani tatelia deserve ni chen rikchilia ani kapchilia to ngombu tembe kable ya maten ko ngeli ka ngombu tembe kable ya ne lot count to suju tujun lot jume kan shas natural kan shas la ya chapchilia ngombu tembe kable ani jiksem ma ship shilu yong ya mikpurabshi ches, ka chik yunjong dang, karina chik ches, regular cheshus, tini labia kam kebatos. To kuzu di, kanda di, lupunguna jamaja tindek ton tagorwa. Subulunguna jamaja dan tindek, no, skin.
So here, I've plotted this sweating response. We call it the skin conductance response. That's what it stands for, SCR. And what you can see is they sweat more when they think they might get a shock, in both cases. But when they're attending to the emotional response, attending to the fact that they might get a shock, they sweat even more than when now they're trying to regulate their emotional response. So here, when they use this imagery strategy, they can decrease, at least their body's emotional response. When I look at the brain, so here I'm just looking at the amygdala, here, this response here. This is how the amygdala responds when I ask them to attend to their natural feelings, the fact that they might get a shock, and we see an increase in response here. When I ask them now to regulate their emotional response, we actually see a decrease in the amygdala response. However, the amygdala is not acting by itself. The amygdala is connected to a number of brain regions, as I told you. So what we saw was not just the amygdala decreasing its response, but a circuit of brain regions became involved. We saw greater activation in this region, what we call the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, when participants engaged in this regulation strategy. And this is the same region that Amishi talked about and Adele talked about as being important in executive control. So it's almost as if when they see these stimuli, and I'm asking them now to think about it differently, they're having to use these executive processes to help it reinterpret the stimulus. This region shows connections to another region here, which we call the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. This is a region that we know has strong connections with the amygdala and is capable of actually inhibiting responses in the amygdala in a number of different paradigms. And these two regions are connected to each other. And we think both of these regions work in conjunction now with diminishing the amygdala response, and in this case, at least the body's expression of the emotional response. So just to sum up this last part, I've suggested to you that our thoughts play an important role in generating emotion. How we appraise a situation or interpret a situation determines our emotional response. And that our thoughts can increase or decrease the brain's response to emotional events. So how we interpret the significance of events can increase or decrease the amygdala's response. And through the interactions with the prefrontal cortex, this gives us a pathway for thoughts to influence the amygdala. And I have one question to finish up that we can talk about in the discussion. So I wanted to ask you, do you think analytic meditation has effects similar to emotion regulation?
Definitely, yeah.
And if,
of course, depends on what we mean by meditation, the word meditation.
Well, I'm leaving that up to you.
이동원의 meditation 샤비는 샤워페인.
For example, like
이동원의 meditation 샤비는 시단페인.
for example, if you meditate on an object of desire and cultivate that familiarity, it will increase your attachment.
Which is, you know,
And if
a
you
form of emotion regulation, perhaps not what you...
and if you focus, you know, single-pointedly on an object of hatred, then it could enhance your hatred.
Well, emotion regulation, as I showed you, can both increase and decrease fear. You know, how we choose to use it is really up to us. And then the question becomes, and this is not something we've looked at, whether either emotion regulation or analytic meditation might influence emotion's impact on attention, memory, and the choices we make. But I don't know if you have any insights into how that might occur.
Analytic meditation tone, emotion regulation
Emotion resilience is 마ting
Yes. So generally speaking, we can, even within the emotions, you can make a distinction between those that are somehow grounded in reason, some kind of rationale, and some that are much more reactive.
But I also think that, you know, our the way that we interpret events can actually, ahead of time, when we come to a situation, will change our immediate reaction. So I think, you know, when we say that, I don't think it's the case that the reason is only dealing with things after the fact. I think how we approach a situation can, ahead of time.
That's true. That's very true.
All right, and finally, I just want to thank you again for this dialogue today.
Thank you, Liz. I think it might be helpful to sort of clarify if, for the following discussion, if both sides of the discussion are understanding the same thing in emotion. Maybe that would be a little bracket that we can open before we make a break. So just that afterwards in the discussion we really talk about the same thing. So would some of you, maybe Alan, would you want to...
I would love for Liz to begin, because a very important point here is that in Tibetan, as we've learned years ago, with all of the sophistication and detail of terms for very specific mental processes, as Rupert filled it in the other day, but there's a lot more detail that he didn't have time to go into. For all the detail that is there, there is no single term in either modern Tibetan or the classic Tibetan that is a
We have in the modern.
with Tibetan. With my mistake,
Tibetan
thank you.
we have.
And what is that?
Not in the classical, Nyongso.
Nyongso. And so, but in the classic, you know, in the classic presentation, there is no term that corresponds closely to emotion. So I think if we're going to initiate such a discussion, it would really be good if you could fill us in on that. And if I could just give one suggestion of what something you might touch on is compassion, is as obviously very central to the whole Buddhist endeavor. Some people believe that compassion is an emotion. Some would say it's not an emotion, it is actually a more of a cognitive state, one of aspiration and yearning, which is conjoined with emotion. But if you could just simply clarify for all of us here, what you mean by emotion, and what would be the demarcations of what is and isn't.
Emotion, even in Sanskrit, I don't think there is a term for emotion.
Modern they use bhavana, but
Bhavana.
Microphone, please.
I'll say that just for the record, and that is in the classical Sanskrit, there is no corresponding term, but they take from the classical, and in the more modern usage of classical, then bhavana.
Bhavana.
I mean, there are words in Sanskrit,
Bhava.
bhava, sthayi bhava, that mean that are Sanskrit, that are used for motion.
Give the microphone.
Yeah.
Vesna Vallas is a Sanskrit scholar, so that's why we're reaching out. Otherwise, I would not encourage that.
Well, yeah, as Rupert mentioned, there is a term bhava, but really began to designate emotion only from the 10th century on, with the introduction of Dharma Shastra and dramatic sentiments and emotions introduced. But we don't have evidence that before that designated emotion.
10th century is fairly early.
So
10th century is fairly early, so.
So maybe I could.
So Liz, please.
Actually, bhavana is
Bhava.
No, please,
Bhava.
please. We want to bring that now.
So yeah,
to
I know.
this.
Maybe I could give a sort of a brief answer, and then, which is not going to be satisfactory, I don't think. I think it's interesting to me that there is no single term for emotion, because I think in the way that we think about emotion in Western science, it's almost a hindrance to have a single term for emotion, because it really isn't one thing. And so even today, in the talk I gave, the different effects I talked about, different components of what I call emotion underlie those effects. So when I talked about emotion enhancing the storage, I know that's completely due to the physiological arousal response that you get, which is a component of emotion. When I talked about attention, the effects on attention, there it's really a signaling of something potentially important that isn't related to physiological arousal. So emotion theorists have had quite a difficult time coming up with even defining what emotion is, and it's never one thing. It's many, many things. And so we call the main theories of emotion component models of emotion, because we break emotion down into its component. If we had to think of one thing that holds all of these things together, is that I would say it's something about signaling what's important to us, what's relevant to us. And so to me, the category of emotion somehow has something to do with signaling what's relevant or what's important. But there's a number of different ways that it's expressed, a number of different ways that it's done, and it's quite confusing to try to come up with all the different details of the things that comprise emotion. And I think it's been difficult for Western science because people don't mean the same thing when they talk about it often. And the fact that we have one word to describe so many things kind of lets us talk past each other at times. Richie, do you want to answer this?
단지 조진 때는 직접 여버티가 고냐 멈추서도스 그래서 저 상말이야 질차베 계절을 째고 열어봤어 그때 가고 싶어 그러셨어 emotions of the 자신의 망보지 수드베 지금 용어로 지마도
Richie, you want to make a...
Well, I wanted to actually ask the Buddhist scholars in some systems of the Abhidharma, at least as I understand it, for each there is one of the mental factors concerns positive, negative, or neutral, and that is regarded as an omnipresent mental factor.
A Vedana, feeling, yeah.
Feeling.
It's translated as feeling.
And so I would like to ask...
So you're talking about it positive, negative in the sense of how it is felt, rather than ethically. Not ethically, from an ethical point of view, positive, negative, but rather from the point of view of joyful, pleasant, unpleasant. That's what you meant. Okay, Risha.
Yes, and so if that is the case, what is the Buddhist understanding of what that positive and negative is actually referring to? Is it some affective coloring or tone to the mental process, or is it some other quality which has not yet been fully described here?
남배 응어배쇼네 셰베나 군동가 시고가 군동가 나로리아 초와지 요레스 고중스 근데 초와들이야 초와들도 당용 숨기 이게 시기로 봤어 다 초와 대원은 동간 당용 숨세대 근데 군도에는 셰바 탐제 줄 연구 완전 셰바 인zel이야 고 레기로 봐 레디글다 초와지 레기들 초와디 대원은 동간은 당용 세고야 돼그 셰바도 용도 걸이야 콜이야 즉 당당이로지 즉 천천히 담아서는 당당이기 고어르지래 용도 걸이야
그거는 디디어래요 강소 디소 디소세 아는 구르시는 디소세
나래 들이
나 텔라 디소야 디소세 디나로는 이 때와요 또 매우 다니
그래서 다 저렇게 한다라 소리지 달라서
아는 가지고 구르면서
소리지 나래 So generally speaking,
솔직히 그런 대화를 통해서 어떻게 하면
yes,
솔직히 강소를 살아이나 디소스
yes,
디소스 좀
Lare.
이문시스
Lare.
이문이 왜 그래
제 이거 다들 그런 건 주변에 또 군도이나 남시 담지가 계속 죽여로 송보된 바인자 다 아니 초진냥 볼래 되고 그랬어
저는 솔직히 듣고
그래서 또 솔직히
좋아하잖아
나래
논쇼죠
So, yes. So of course this is he's also saying that this is his own take on this. When we bring up concepts like feeling in the Buddhist context, one needs to one needs to understand this because it's an activity. So one needs to understand it in terms of an agent that experiences it, or the instrument by which you experience it, and then the object of that experience, and what is being experienced, in the manner in which it is being experienced. So, so when we talk about pleasant and unpleasant and neutral feeling, positive, negative, neutral feeling, then it is the object of the feeling, what is being felt. So then there is the subject feeling aspect of the feeling, and that is this receptivity to what kind of feeling that might be encountered. So when we say the omnipresent mental factors, feeling in that context, it is the subjective component part of that feeling, which is this receptivity to whatever feeling may it encounter, whatever experience it may encounter.
소리도 소화 디솔 세종아 아당 아주 꾸중한 시야지 디솔 세드 맞다 맞지 멜로 성기
대들이 나데
가 아, 리시고 하다 이시고야 가가로.
그래. 근데 나도 용배네. 초대 뭐 깨고. 디소로 있네.
디소로.
소르저
저거 딩올 깨고.
딩올 깨고.
딩올죠. 근데 로컬이 대변 올 깨고. 인식 올 깨고. 전다
찍으러 차거래. 소르지데 디소로 있네. 무시 초로 용되고라. 초대 뭐 깨고.
아다 가야 돼. 아다 우메숑 샤시디 잉의시고를 같이 쇼어들이.
나래 잉어래. 이거 무슨 돈 많이 마셔서
있는 거 셔통 되게 되나 근데 이거로 그냥 대응업직이네 근데 사실 해서 대응업자가 지금 이해하면 와
나래
그래서 때니 시켜 봐도 해면 와 자다 이내 그래서 때려가는 지금 샤야 준 거로 타냐를 봐 오는 샤 저다 솔지 그 좋아도 구두사다 디가
디초와서 제법보다 작으로 바꾼다 나래 너
다음에는 선가
So his own feeling is that when we talk about Vedana or feeling in the context of the five omnipresent mental factors that are present in So it is this subjective component. So of course, when it experiences whatever feeling tone it experiences, it takes that shape or it takes that form. But conceptually, still you can make a distinction between a subjective aspect and the objective aspect of the actual experience. So, for example, when we conceptualize an act, so there is an object of action, there is the actual act itself, and then there is the agent. So conceptually, one needs to make a distinction, but in actual fact, it may be the one and the same thing sometimes.
So with this, I would like to make a break, a tea break, and then we gather again in 15 minutes. Thank you. The question regarding what is emotion, I would like to bring it quickly back to Rupert to make a small addition, and then we can maybe go over to Mathieu because he has an idea about positive, negative, and neutral emotions. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that I think that maybe the fact that there is no obvious word for emotion in, say, Pali and Tibetan, coming from Sanskrit for this word, this concept emotion, maybe a little bit of a red herring. It's not really, it doesn't really tell us anything. It sometimes seems to me that it's taken as implying that in Abhidhamma and in the list of so-called mental factors, emotion is not included. But in fact, all the, I mean, just as in the Sanskrit dramatic theory, they have this later word that they have emotion, and they give a list of 8 things that have emotion, rasa and these bhava. All of them are in practice included in the list of chaita in both Theravada and Abhidharma Kosha. So we have.
Let me translate. Pyoge Pali Sanskrit mebadiki mixekia tanya ko mebeke remindus pen Sanskrit na chacha bena jail tanda nyam kuyurwa chik ningji nyam da pawe nyam da nyam ke chebe kam tikit sam rasa taraga rasa la gorwa tikiti tebe na tanda simjung ngap jusa ji ta simjung ki tuna chiraba tikiti simjung tena chude yores these are emotion rigman but simjung na chude yores.
Okay. So, within the Abhidhamma, we have emotions. We have anger, joy, friendliness, envy, and so forth. So, all those things are there. I think it's also important that there's a tendency in Abhidhamma, I think, to want to separate feeling from emotion. So, feeling is something very, very simple. Any experience we have can either register as pleasant, I like it, unpleasant, I dislike it, neutral, I'm not sure what I think about this. And the point is then that feelings can be then associated with what would be considered kusala, wholesome emotions, or akusala, unwholesome emotions. So I can have a pleasant feeling when I'm sitting greedily eating my meal. That is pleasant feeling, but with the emotion of greed. I can also have a pleasant feeling when I am sitting talking to someone and the conversation is friendly. Then there is pleasant feeling associated with adosa, friendliness, metta. So I think there is quite a lot in Abhidhamma, in effect, about emotion.
And when I suggested that it wasn't there, it was certainly not at all to imply that emotions aren't discussed, but simply that category of emotions, non-evoked emotions. And I say I'm still not very. I mean, I'm perhaps asking for too much because the clarity is not present already. But just the notion of signaling what is significant and not significant. This is not a debate. It's not comparing one system to another. But I'm thinking of a data analyst simply going through some numbers, and for his particular agenda, he says, "Well, this is noise, but this is significant data." And utterly dispassionate, he might almost be bored to death. He's been doing this for 3 hours, and yes, significant data and not insignificant. And would you, and this is really simply a question, but is that still emotion?
Well, I think, I don't know if this is working.
Yeah.
Morangi emotion dikete sama jion kepe keju zoru jungun zimba inas. Ani di kanta nedun Ellen ta mol chodan gor. Ta mola la yadliya nedun di keju jun kar yime toliya dadangye jiliya. Ta di dadangye de ni emotion tamjegi. 지겹 그 계절을 좀 먼저 제어를 봐. 에런 것에나 나다야디 베나 미지 생리버지 심주체 제바 좀 되었다 그래요. 다디 내가 유니지리샤 내가 매니지리샤 내가 유니지 내가 매니지리샤 임비담이나 제 다데고 그 녀업제 이모션 자 매버지 던데 그 내가 제고 걸어. 도 제대 아니 그 시그널 제도로 왔어. 근데 이모션 카드스 리고 그래서
So I think now we're playing on the meaning of the word significant as opposed to the meaning of the word emotion. I don't think anything that's significant in any context means it's emotional. But it is the case. I mean, we try to say what holds all these things together, this signaling system that is emotion. It's somehow telling you that this is important to you.
More
Now-
existentially, like for your well-being, your survival,
Yes,
and all that.
yes.
Rather, this is just your job
Exactly.
and getting $10 an hour.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that's much clearer.
Yeah, there can be a lot of confusion about the word positive, negative, constructive, destructive. So we had a whole Mind and Life meeting on emotion, and subsequently with Richie Allen and Paul Ekman, we also tried to sort that out. So just in a nutshell, because we speak a lot of pleasant, unpleasant, positive, negative. When we say often in psychology, positive and negative is going towards something or averting or moving away from something. Of course, in Buddhist context, positive will be more happiness and negative more suffering or less happiness. So in that sense, we would say that the positive emotion is constructive toward flourishing and well-being, while another one is destructive. So it has nothing to do with attraction, in a way, with pleasant and unpleasant, because as just said, a very pleasant momentary experience leading to hedonic happiness may in the end cause a lot of suffering, while sadness, for instance, which are very unpleasant, at the same time could be compatible with sukha, which is a way of being strong, free, within, compassionate, and all that, a sense of orientation in existence, which is compatible with genuine demonic happiness. So that's why we more use constructive and destructive emotion than positive and negative. And pleasant and unpleasant is quite superficial, because they could lead either way to suffering or happiness.
Yes.
So that's why we need to unpack all those from both perspectives.
I agree completely, and I think, as I mentioned briefly before, it's a real hindrance to Western science that we aren't being more clear about what we mean when we say emotion, because just as I did today, because that's the tradition, we say emotion does X, and it certainly isn't just emotion. There's more to it than that, and the fact that our language isn't meeting our conceptual understanding, not that that would be easy to do, but it could be better than it is, I think is preventing us from thinking about these things in a detailed way that might be helpful.
Richie, you had something you wanted to add?
I just wanted to make one additional distinction that was relevant to Alan's question, and that is that there are systems in the mind and the brain for detecting emotional cues or emotional stimuli in our environment, and there are other systems for related systems for actually generating an emotion, and those are not necessarily the same thing. And so we can detect that an event or a stimulus is potentially significant, but that doesn't necessarily engender an emotional response in a person. The generation of an emotional response may be particularly important for motivating action, but that is from the perceptual process of detecting significant events.
And just to add to what
레베 차시엘 대센터마서는 사실 가까이 오랬어. 맨날 중얼 없이 태베 가버야. 중얼대 수술이야. 개치 중. 다 문제 진행죠 봐. 디체베 가버야. The emotionally important, unimportant. 등군진 체베 야 레베 차시지 오랬어. 대한 레베 차시지리야. emotion 기두거야. 저번에 레베 차시지 오랬어. 디니디 야 집어 입는 게 보잖아요, 말했어.
emotion 가리겠네.
emotion 기두거.
그러면 이거
당부도 있다. emotionally important. 수수도 개체 중 문제 진행지.
대인지.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
그래서 로 이제 뭔가 쉬우지다. 가스게션을 컴플렉스를 왜 쉬우지 알아마도 되게 짠 말이야.
So we did touch upon this, question of complexity of the processes when something like this, something like an emotion arises. So it's not just one thing that happens.
근데 발렌이 쉬우죠.
There are also a lot of implicit influences.
So, Johanni, when you are in these discussions with science and let's say, with the Western notion of emotion, how do you conceptualize emotion coming from a tradition that has a different approach?
Or as we
No clarity.
Me too.
So still in a state of confusion or ignorance. So that brings more curiosity to listen. this explanation like that. Oh, yes.
I think that the points that both Mathieu and Rupert made regarding Rupert's distinction between feeling and emotion and Mathieu's emphasis on wholesome and unwholesome, I think this represents a very important challenge for Western conceptions of emotion in psychology and neuroscience. And we've been talking with you, Your Holiness, for many years about these issues. And it's slowly infiltrating mainstream psychology and neuroscience, but it's still the case that in our experiments, in the experiments of most Western scientists who are studying emotion, the fundamental categories are categories that are still, I think, confounding wholesome and unwholesome. Because a positive feeling, as we heard, can arise in the context of an unwholesome situation or a wholesome situation. And that distinction, I think, may be crucial to the brain. That may help actually resolve some of the ambiguities in our own research. And I think that we need to take this dimension more seriously in the research that is being done in Western emotion science.
초원대회 조어진이다 동해 조어진이 두심지 당시 positive negative 용어도 용두가냐 두심지 당시 아마도 네베르젠다 페베르젠 임지당 거로 다디 나베 임지당한테 고주 선단에 계지 못 차대셔서 그래서 고주 직 용어부 초 대두고 돈에 임지당에 되게 강하게 망부지 take those.
So just to follow up on what Richie said, I think, if it's important in behavior, I'll take it a step further. It definitely is going to be somehow represented in the brain in a way we can see. But I think the challenge for us scientists is to find a way to really define the concepts, what we mean, wholesome, unwholesome, and how we can verify that. Because for us, we have to understand the behavior and the psychological construct and be able to measure it before we can actually say anything about the brain. And this is, I think, in emotion, a huge challenge. Our ability to discuss it and conceptualize it and talk about the subtlety goes way beyond our ability to manipulate it and assess it and quantify it. And I think we're going to have to find a way to bridge that a little bit more before we're really going to get a hold of this in terms of the brain function.
So His Holiness's own personal feeling is that when we are doing science, basic science, analyzing what the mental processes are, investigation, on that level, he's wondering whether this evaluation of wholesome, unwholesome is actually a good thing or a bad thing, or relevant.
Is it even
relevant.
Relevant. Wholesome unwholesome level.
Of course, that is separate from the other question, which is very scientifically open as well, which is to try to understand those types of emotions which we agree to be wholesome and what their behavioral expressions are and their effects and so on, and how are they expressed at the brain level. And those emotions which we generally recognize to be unwholesome, what their expressions are, what their behavioral outcomes are. That is, of course, a scientific question of investigation.
Then I think another thing, the demarcation, wholesome, unwholesome, not based on our common sort of concept. But you see, research, those emotions which bring inner peace, calm mind, and also as a result, the physical action, the verbal action become more peaceful, more nice. That brings more happiness on others' mind. And also ultimately, very positive was the impact in our body, then we describe that is wholesome. Those emotions immediately disturb our inner peace, and as a result, expression harsh.
Yeah, harsh words.
That also brings more uncomfortable on others, including animal, and ultimately very harmful for body. Yes. Then we demarcation.
Yeah.
Demarcation where?
That's how the demarcation should be.
That then consider unwholesome. So now here I think very complicated. In human mind, I think the justice, truthful, not double face.
Right.
That also, I think by nature, even to some extent, the animal also used to appreciate your honesty. So that also I think involved. Something brings some satisfaction or inner peace, but actually go against with
justice,
honesty.
No.
So ultimately, that brings some uncomfortable deep inside. So that should you see in the category of unwholesome. Although brings some pleasure. For the moment, some peace of mind, maybe
satisfaction.
But ultimately, it may increase some uncomfortable. So that should bring unwholesome. And other, temporarily, a little bit uncomfortable. But still, you have truthful conviction. There's no need to say double stand. Double stand. That brings you inner strength. Clear? So I think complicated. These things are complicated.
So the point is, how do we draw the line between wholesome versus unwholesome? It should not be contingent entirely upon how it feels, but a sense of fairness and justice also need to play a role in that determination. So there's a wonderful summary in the Bodhisattva precepts on the trainings of the Bodhisattva, where it says that in summary, it says the Bodhisattvas should act in the following. Even if it is painful to you, so having explained all the specifics of the precepts in the preceding section, and then there is a summary point where it says that the Bodhisattvas should act in the following. Even it is painful to you. If it is so first, he should engage in actions that are beneficial and joyful. So it's beneficial in the short term and leading to happiness in the long term. So even if it is painful, if it is beneficial, one should do it. So the idea here is that in the short term, even if it leads to some form of suffering, if in the long run it's leading to happiness, one should do it. So even it feels pleasant, if it is unhelpful, then one should not do it. If it is hurtful, harmful, one should not do it. Here is again, in the immediate it may seem pleasurable, but if it is hurtful in the long term, a long run, one should not do it.
I think that was the concept. I think cover all, I think, for the universal value.
So you would also, of course, tie in ethics into all that.
This is the ethics layer was.
맞아? 늘 ethics하는 파시고 말다. 다 ethics. Never 안 ethics.
Well, it's that's not the way to look at this. The way to look at it is to actually...
There is no absolute
ethics, yeah. It's
no
not,
absolute good.
Yeah. It's not the case that you have first a set of ethics and then you bring it into your understanding of what is wholesome and what is unwholesome, but rather it's the other way around. You analyze the mental reality and find which is harmful and helpful, beneficial. Long run. And then on the basis of understanding that, then the summary kind of conclusion would be the ethics. But it's not the case that you're bringing ethics into the investigation of reality.
Of course, that's Buddhist viewpoint. Buddhist viewpoint.
Buddhist approach now. Buddhist approach.
Right.
Buddhist approach now.
Buddhist approach. Some of the theistic sort of tradition, little different. Okay, we must respect that.
Mathieu?
So as you see from his earnest, actually there are ways to investigate that. And you can say short and long term. You can say the search of fluctuating hedonic pleasure or happiness, and the more deeper way of being of eudaimonic happiness. So these criteria can be applied, and not a dogmatic ethic of good and evil, but embedded contextual human-related situation of what brings suffering and happiness. So those are not vague ideas. I mean, we can really, if we see it from that perspective, I mean, there are ways to then consider emotion by their impact.
I had given Adele first.
I want to make a comment and then say what I wanted to say. The comment is that I think that Your Holiness has given us a way to look at it that makes it less complicated. Because you say, look at the effect on the body over the years. And that gives us an objective way to do it. So you have made it much less complicated. Thank you. What I was going to say, though, is there are other ways that are really important about how thought and language affects emotion to reduce suffering. And I thought that it would be helpful to mention this. Jamie Pennybaker has worked with people in communities that go through horrific events, like a terrible flood or an earthquake, things like that. And he's asked people to just keep a journal, to just write about their experiences and their emotions. And he finds that reduces their stress, improves their psychological well-being, but also improves their physical well-being. Now, many people will say if you go to a therapist or you talk to somebody who listens compassionately, but that's more complicated because you're also getting all the good things that come from the interaction. This eliminated the interaction. You're just putting it into language. And that in itself changed the way it's represented in the brain, the way it's experienced in the body and the mind. We know that it's much better to have a good attachment with your mother, your parents, than an insecure attachment. An insecure attachment leads to suffering later. But they've shown in studies that if you can come up in language with a coherent understanding of what happened when you were little with your mother, not making it right, not making it justifying it, but just coming up with some understanding of it, the outcome of people with an insecure attachment are just as good in adulthood as those with a secure attachment. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that it looks like the way this happens is that the prefrontal cortex dampens down the amygdala, as if the amygdala is kind of a fire alarm that keeps, saying stress, stress, and you're not able to come up with some coherent way of addressing it. And just putting things into language changes how the brain deals with it and affects our psychological well-being and our physical well-being. I just wanted to mention that.
들으셨던데 간다 수준 용도 숙정부터는 다 스트레스 당강에선 그냥 준중한 밤에 도부당하셔부터 되게 영원들이요나 하고 디 아빅들레 액티비티 숙정부로 되게 되고 and 수준 용어디 템텐제 템날 슈거나 티브 지보기 개조식을 개화시면 누구도서
express
제도를 다대비지 prefrontal 기타 상당히 되도록 디기 파 아니 에밍텔에 대해서 충분하면서 세계에도 맞는 충분하면서 Diego, can I just step out of the interpreter's role and just make a simple point?
Absolutely.
Because the discussion came up about why there is this big sort of contrast between the Eastern classical Indian tradition versus the West with regard to whether or not there is a specific term for emotion and what that suggests. And here, perhaps, since we don't have Sean, I could play the philosopher's role. And also, one thing that is important sometimes is to bring the historical perspective. One thing that we have to understand is that Western science grew out of Greek thought. And this kind of dichotomy between passions and reason has been a very important ancient heritage of Western thought. And the concept of emotion as a separate kind of an entity has its roots in this Plato's distinction between the three components of the soul, where passion has an important role. And there's often a conflict between passion and reason. Perhaps that may have been an important basis. And that kind of dichotomy was never really articulated in the Eastern context.
Can I respond to that?
Thank you.
Passion, the reason.
Yeah, Liz?
So I think you're absolutely correct. And I think we see this now a lot when we talk about decision making. So in some of the neuroeconomic research that I've been getting into more and more, there's been this talk about emotion and cognition as two competing systems in the brain. And I think this is not a very sophisticated approach, but it's almost like in trying to talk about the approach where emotion integrates in many different complex ways, is such a hard hurdle to overcome in Western science because of this strong tradition that I think comes from the early philosophical writings about passion and reason being two opposing forces as opposed to interacting forces to allow us to arrive at the correct conclusion.
Make one point and then I'll pass it on to Dave.
I just want to make one point about this, which is I think that most neuroscientists today would agree that the brain does not respect the dichotomy that was handed to us by the Greek tradition.
Yes.
Absolutely. Greek 임제 망비당하셔죠. 레베나 다디 임제 당동 말했어.
사실은.
Dave?
I would like to bring attention back, at least briefly, to the notion of beneficial in the long term. So there are many people in the world, and often, on occasion, one is confronted with a situation where one can make a decision such that by taking act one, many people will be benefited somewhat. Their suffering will go down and their happiness will go up. But in contrast, one might make another decision instead that will improve the situation of fewer people, but to a greater extent. I might make a decision such that I can create enlightenment in a much smaller group of people while the suffering and is worse and the happiness is less for the rest of the people. So you have a situation that involves a moral dilemma. Suppose there is a man on a bridge and I'm standing next to him, and if I push him off the bridge, I can save 5 people down below because his body will stop a train that's about to run into 5 people down below who don't see the train coming. What should I do? Should I sacrifice the life of the one man in order to increase the happiness of the 5 down below? How do I resolve all of this according to the precepts of Buddhism, compassion, and so forth when I'm deliberating this and there's only 2 seconds to decide whether or not to push?
네. I think sometimes we have to think it very seriously from the theoretical viewpoint and the practical viewpoint. Sometimes there is sort of the contradictions.
Contradiction or conflict.
So using our common sense on the case by case.
Case by case.
That's important. 아주 준준하지 이거도와. 다 자학한테 가 있는 거 가서 그래. 그게 팬이 다 자치주 연식 때다 돌아요, 사실. 다 팬이 쓴 거에 absolute 믿어봐.
네.
어?
네. In fact, in Shantideva's text, there is basically a point raised that in the end, how one acts in a given situation. So how one acts in a given situation is that the person should really weigh what is the most appropriate thing to do in the end. Because there's going to be conflicts. And Shantideva says that use your knowledge and act accordingly.
From theoretical viewpoint, 대변인지쟁이 any 미 국제도 구주 고교 소교야 된다라 미직세.
From the theoretical point of view, in Buddhism, in fact, there is a discussion of this problem, and there is a story of a bodhisattva who was a captain of a ship.
One of previous sort of the life of the Buddha.
And in this ship, there was a murderer who was going to commit an act of killing all the passengers on the ship, and in order to save all the passengers, he had to kill this
999. This way.
No, 999 passengers. So in
order 1,000
people on the ship, yeah.
Group of people,
yeah.
1,000. And out of 1,000, one person thinking to eliminate the rest of the people, then all the belongings or possess, you see.
He could take them, yeah.
So then the Buddha's, so the previous life is that. Then you see, judge, killing. Generally, I mean, one killing many, both bad.
Negative law.
Must avoid. But now there is no other choice. One person determined to kill the rest of his companion. He gave several warnings, but he never sort of dropped that sort of plan. Then that person, you see, calculate. If I kill this one person in order to save 999 persons' life, now here important thing is, if he let that person kill 999 people, then this person will get sin, killing,
negative karma.
Negative karma, 999 people, killing of 999
people.
If he, the Buddha's previous life, if he killed this person, he got a sin. But just so killing one. Then most important, so
from So here you will have a situation where the Bodhisattva, in order to save this potential murderer from committing a negative karma of killing 999 people, he willingly took upon himself the act of killing this one individual and taking the karmic consequences of that one murder. So here, in a sense, what we have is a form of giving and taking, Tonglen practice. Yes. So now to follow up on this, David, your point, earlier I cited that summary from a particular text. After having listed all the Bodhisattva precepts, I did leave out one final line, which says that for whose heart is pure or virtuous, and there is no sin. there is no fault.
So ultimately, depend one's own ultimate motivation. Sincere compassion, sincere sense of concern of others' well-being. Usually, these demarcation, right and good, usually is based on our egoistic attitude. This is someone who thoroughly trained the egoistic attitude diminish, full of compassion, sense of concern of rest of the
others
and transcendent being, then egoistic tone the right or wrong
So for that individual, then the demarcation that is normally drawn between what is right and wrong from a sort of a self-centered perspective no longer applies. So, in fact, there is a statement in Dodrup Jingme Tembe Nyima, great Dzogchen master of early 20th century, where he says that in the context of discussing matters at the level of fundamental innate mind of clear light, don't bring in conversations that are on the level of coarse everyday consciousness. So in this, in relation to this, in Shantideva's text, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, Bodhicharya Avatara, where he says that, talking about Bodhisattva's ethics, he says that given the far-sightedness of the great compassionate Buddhas, even those that have been conventionally prohibited from a, conventional norms were permitted to the Bodhisattvas. So in the case of this ethical dilemma, the ethical dilemma that you presented of the person who's standing up on the bridge and wondering whether he should push this other person down, first of all, that person needs to have cultivate bodhicitta, this altruistic, then he will be able to know what to do.
That motivation, then okay. Whatever he done, okay. That's
an option too.
When they ask that question in the lab about that dilemma, they say you cannot jump yourself, you have to push on it.
Yeah.
But in real life, as he's always said, then you would jump yourself. That's the only way.
No, but generally the ethical dilemma is where the person who's standing next to you is large enough so that that weight of that person can block. Whereas if you jump, to finish the scenario. No, that was the idea.
Yes.
That was the idea.
That we cannot say 100%. Ultimately, motivation. That you can see.
Rechitan the ethical dilemma Kuranji Shizon. The Kuzu Kijima Shegor, that the Shevekalia Sampagan, Daniel, Pita Daniel Jorba, Daniel Kuru, Shakam Bruce Madiomar, the Koshakam Daza, Koma Chombe and Rilicato Yomarba. That's at the line, the Misha Jaffers Kurt.
I've got to receive a dog. What does it say?
And it's Pija Rilicato. So if the person happens to be someone quite large, that means he ought to jump himself.
Alan, you wanted to make a comment?
Yeah, we have this enormous term emotion that is so prominent in our Western, ever going back to Plato. The term that is so dominant, central in Buddhist understanding of the mind, that we've not really unpacked much yet, is the word klesha in Sanskrit. And I would suggest it's often translated, I've often translated as mental affliction, but in my conversation with Bob Thurman just last night, it's not simply a feeling of being afflicted, but rather it's a tendency of the mind, a process of the mind that gives rise to affliction. So more of an afflictive tendency. The definition of this in Tibet, well, I forget the Tibetan, is it's a mental process that disturbs the equilibrium or upsets the peace of the mind. Now, as Holland has often commented, that when you experience very strong compassion, you don't feel really peaceful. The mind is certainly aroused. You wouldn't say I'm feeling, serenity at that time. But it's a reality-based disequilibrium, a reality-based arousal. And so therefore, even though the surface is disturbed, at core, it's very grounded, and there is a deep equilibrium. But I think this raises a very rich interface with cognitive neuroscience, psychology. And to take an example, loving kindness is a virtue. It's not a mental affliction. And we cultivate this through meditation, and what it is a very genuine, heartfelt caring and yearning that oneself, others may experience genuine happiness and the causes of happiness. But now there are false facsimiles, things that one can very easily oneself mistake for loving kindness. And so one may be practicing loving kindness meditation and just feel a very pleasant feeling. It's really sweet. And think that's loving kindness. It's not, it's just a feeling. But more pernicious than this is that one may mistake it for something that is really self-centered gratification, as in sexual love, sexual infatuation. I love you so much, I can't live without you. Here, have all this stuff. And one feels so much love for this person. In fact, it's not loving kindness at all. It's a mental affliction of craving. It's all about my gratification. Take one other example, but this does lead to a question, and that is compassion. Compassion also is not simply a feeling. It's not simply empathy or sadness for the other, but rather a profound yearning. May you be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. Once again, that's a virtue. But there are false facsimiles. For example, moral indignation. Moral indignation when one sees a victimizer.
Moral indignation. 초심을 당심들지. 시행기 저거 독주 제배는 다티 말하면 죄송선 당심처럼.
And one feels very moral indignation, moral righteousness, that I'm so outraged and I'm feeling so compassionate, completely conflate these things. Whereas in fact it may be really the afflictive tendency of anger, but manifesting in the guise from the first person is I'm feeling tremendously compassionate, and therefore I'm going to write a big check, but it's really all about anger. But the false facsimile that's classically presented in the Theravada scriptures is actually despair. Is despair. And that is one looks at the world of suffering and feels tremendous sadness. And so what would be so interesting, I think, as the Buddhists are seeking to get help from the scientific community, not simply have interesting conversation, and that is we are easily deluded as we are trying to assess our own practice. And is this genuine loving kindness? Is this genuine compassion? Is my mind right now, has it succumbed to an afflictive tendency or not? Right? It would be marvelous to know what parts of the brain are being activated in genuine loving kindness as opposed to simply self-centered attachment and gratification and so on. Do you think this is feasible, or is it just way too subtle for cognitive neuroscience to access?
So I have
some kind of closeness feeling, or love, out of sexual, very close sort of feeling to his friend, that usually called biased. And very much sort of related with equal, my friend, my wife, my husband, like that. So that, because biased, that kind of sort of closeness feeling or sense of concern never extend towards your enemy. Now, genuine compassion is not based on something good for me, not that way. But those sentient beings who have the experience of pleasure or pain, just like myself, who do not want suffering, yet is passing through suffering. So on that recognition, develop sense of concern. Now that, not sort of because of the concern whether other sort of attitude towards yourself, friendly or negatively. Doesn't matter. Your enemy, also sentient being, also have every right, just like me, to overcome this suffering. So from that way, it's a developed sense of concern, compassion. That is unbiased, genuine compassion. That kind of compassion only comes through training. The other type of biased compassion is a biological factor. So like that. That I think we can make distinction. So then another thing, the genuine, unbiased compassion, which come from training, reasons, there is solid basis. So full competence, inner strength. The other one can go with fear, hatred, some other sort of negative emotion, also you see, I think very much involved. And much sort of, I think, oriented at others' attitude. The other one, not on the attitude, but the being. So big differences. So one day, I think our specialist, you see the brain turning, yawachin question, oh, that the chamba, because of the chamsity, unbiased.
So, ideally it would be a nice situation if we can reach a point where neuroscientists can, looking at the brain, say, okay, so this is a biased form of compassion and this is a unbiased form of compassion.
Then through that way, I think most important, which is I really want is, that unbiased compassion is really good for our health. The biased compassion is bad for our health. Then we can educate the rest of the 6 billion human beings. Everybody take care of health. And without pay much sort of attention about because of the doctor. Then doctor become jobless.
Did you want to answer?
With your list.
So I was going to say to Alan, excuse me, I think prior to getting at the place where we can look at the brain and tell these things, we need to know how we could identify it without looking at the brain. That's the most important thing, because once we can be sure that we're identifying these differences without looking at the brain, then we can go into the scanner and try to see what the differences are in the brain. And then I think Richie wants to follow up, but I have a question.
But I'd like to just respond very briefly to that. And that is, the onus is back on the meditators, on the Buddhists. And that is to have people, whether Buddhist, Christian, I don't care, or not religious, but really spending the time as scientists of the mind, training compassion. And so in relationship with your teacher, who hopefully is an expert, getting more and more people who have rigorously and in a sustained fashion trained in loving kindness, trained in compassion, so that there's a lot of confidence from the first person side. This really is it. Then get the brain scan, and then find the facsimiles and so forth. This would be really a tremendously rich interface.
But if I understand Your Holiness correctly, in unbiased compassion, there really should be the cultivation of the compassion, the wish for suffering to be eliminated and the causes of suffering in all beings, including those with whom one may disagree or with whom conflict arises. And so this presents, I think, a very tractable set of methods for us as scientists. So we can, for example, look to see if even a simple thing is presenting pictures of people with whom one may have some difficulty. Pictures of, say, George Bush. Maybe, and see whether the same feeling of behavioral as well as brain signatures of compassion arise in response to all individuals. That's something that is potentially tractable. And the other issue is one of clinging. It seems that that biased compassion is associated with clinging. And I think that there are ways that we can begin to get measures of clinging, both behaviorally as from...
Even at the brain level, clinging?
Well, yes, even at the brain level. And so... yeah, I certainly think it's possible. We know that there are studies in addiction, for example, where there's very strong clinging and craving that is measurable in the brain.
Well, just on the way to...
딱 그 로징에게 로션다 짐바 다 덴진사 다 디케스들리고 다 등진 덴진사들이 배녀도 배 사버리셔야 돼. 배무슨 요 사버. 랑데남 샤샤네 다와 차라가 왕기 rangting gashigi lo tundul zia and rather gashi when shavina tao charchibi zane lo chinjilo loshi resin shegraba that did in your
So given that we are talking about now a way of measuring and observing the effects of the klesha, I'm still going to stick with my afflictions rather than afflictive tendencies. Nyomong 6 hours to Bob Thaman Kranya Geshe affliction malaj afflictive tendency.
If you want to be attached to afflictions.
So since we are now talking about ways of measuring and observing and testing what constitutes an afflicted state and unafflicted states and so on, another confounding factor is actually again, the element of grasping, and what constitutes a valid, kind of veridical state of mind, and what constitutes a distorted state of mind, even within the Buddhist tradition, depending upon how subtle your understanding of reality is, how subtle your view of reality is, what ultimate reality is, what may seem to be a veridical state of mind in one philosophical school may turn out to be non-veridical and distorted from another perspective. So this is a confounding factor in this.
Translate a little bit more.
So the other case of equal set the Joshua to say that equal and jolly you do zane. Martin Sadi, Chiveloim. That Mar Zinrulia, Chiva Chayas and Taka Genjan Chayadi. Not temper zimbe lot tigi on there. Now means of doesn't not zimbe lot tigi, because I saw you that never check look here, chigmela.
So, for example, one of the key elements in many of these afflicted mental states is their rootedness in one way or another to some form of egocentrism or self-centered attitude or perspective. So again, this question about self-regarding or some sort of self-identity, what constitutes a distorted form and what constitutes a kind of a undistorted form will depend very much on how you understand the nature of selfhood or personal identity to be. So, for example, if your identity of yourself is premised upon some belief in some kind of enduring reality to your own person, then that kind of attitude, and ego becomes distorted because there is no basis. There is a grasping to some kind of permanence. On the other hand, you have a self-identity that is simply taking self or a person to be a kind of a nominal reality, like a kind of a case holder. And then, of course, any reference that you make to that kind of identity will not be a form of distorted self-view. So, of course, all of these issues come up.
Of course, that's from Buddhist viewpoint, right? So, is the one Buddhist, I think, very, very unique Buddhist sort of concept is anattama.
No self, no.
No self. So that's the connection now here. So usually, not much is the connection when we drink, when we sort of lunch. You say the concept of non-self is no relevant. But when we think deeper way about the self-centered sort of attitude, grasping, then this concept is very much
relevant. Yeah.
There's a little bit more that was untranslated, and that was His Holiness was speaking about any type of mental affliction. I'm going to stick with that too for the time being, knowing that it's an afflictive tendency of the mind. I'm going to call it for short mental affliction. That for any of them, whether it's craving or attachment, there's going to be an underlying reification of the object that one is grasping onto as being intrinsically desirable, intrinsically undesirable. And so this is where one grasps onto it as something inherently existent, something more tangible, substantial than, remember our earlier conversation when I said, is Rupert here? Oh yes, in a manner of speaking, I see Rupert, he's right over there. It's in a manner of speaking, it's just that, it's nothing more. I'm not seeing some inherently existent ego, a person over there who has a body, has a mind, but just in a manner of speaking. But when the craving or hostility as mental afflictions arise, they tend to really grasp and reify, taking out of context. So George Bush, not seeing all of the influences that have come and give rise to his behavior, just the real George Bush. And that then becomes the
independent absolute.
Independent absolute, an object of profound craving and attachment for some people.
Mathieu?
I wanted to say that there's already experimental approach to precisely try to distinguish the different components of compassion. And preliminary work with Tanya Singer and Richie's lab, for instance, to distinguish empathy, which is the resonance with others' suffering, sensitivity to it, and suffering because of others' suffer. And then when you add, from the contemplative perspective, unconditional compassion and loving kindness, there is an experiential difference, an experimental difference. So this is already getting into the components of compassion.
Liz, you had a last question?
So Your Holiness, I wanted to ask, in my presentation I talked quite a bit about how emotion changes sensation and attention and memory, and I was wondering if there's anything in the Buddhist teachings that talks about a similar effect of emotion on things like sensation and attention and memory.
단다디 모람 송시et 나리아 emotion 그토네 뇽와다 망부질이야 파쇼는 되게 버콜이야 세브슈르바 남베숑 나로리아 된데 셰바요나스 다이는 뇽몽가 바 쇼는 되고 그게 좀 비슷해요.
저는 저한테 아주 배달하고도 다 관문산 사는 시에도 템퍼레이처
the 남베숑
도나셔요 지금 남자 예배소로 그런 지 샹샤 예배소로 충분히는 그때 믹스해 되듯이 pay attention to it.
No, it's what you have presented the impact. The kind of the mutual relationship between how emotion influences one's thoughts and behavior and so on, and how thoughts then in turn loops back and influences how one emotionally react. This is 100%. It's in some sense it's actually a common sense, and it's very similar to the way Buddhists would understand. So in fact, the experiments that you have done is very beneficial to the Buddhists to learn.
Well, thank you.
There's a whole genre of meditation, of insight meditation, called the close application of mindfulness to phenomena, in which one is not looking at just one type of phenomena or another, but looking at the interactions from a first-person perspective of emotions, thoughts, influences, and so forth, and exactly looking at these type of interdependences, and especially looking for which types of processes, thoughts, and so forth give rise to genuine happiness and which ones are obstructing it. That's very central to Buddhist meditation, insight meditation.
So one
박수 뒤에 비켜져요. 더 옴비셔블리티 두 뭐를 째째. 이제 또외가 구름디 더 셰시버로. 더 현다가리야다 가서 그게 매마다. 지코레만 다들 잡아주기. 동세도 지코레 못 째째.
So one advantage of bringing the scientific perspective is that you have a way of visually presenting your findings. In the Buddhist context, we rely heavily on the words and the explanation and using the mind to try to, kind of comprehension and kind of reasoning processes. There is, however, been a recognition that visual representation is important. For example, even the Buddha himself developed this, the Wheel of Life, which presents visually the 12 links of interdependent origination that portrays the birth of a sentient being in the cycle of existence. And then also there is a chart that maps out the 9 stages of attentional development, associated with shamatha. So, but these are very kind of 1 or 2 very minor attempts to visually represent. But science, of course, brings a very rich and powerful representation that can be shown visually.
So eventually we introduce, somebody introduce in our class.
Yeah.
And particularly those young students, I think very
helpful.
I think very helpful.
Yes.
Good.
Yes, Your Holiness. So we break for lunch and dedicate ourselves to grasping to food, maybe not too much, but enjoy.
The first function of emotion on attention. So this is from yesterday's tea break. And as you can see, Sonia is engaged in a conversation with Cliff. Myla is talking to Sonia. Now, Sonia is close to Cliff, and if she chose to, she could hear what Cliff is saying. Instead, she is using her attention to focus on what Myla is saying in this noisy room. And that's what attention does. It helps us select some things to pay attention to and other things to ignore because they're not relevant. If, however, Cliff were to start to say something about Sonia, she might hear her name, even though she's trying to ignore Cliff. She can't ignore something relevant coming through.
미버디 모란게시스 되대요자 암조 코들이야 나만 샤샤그레스 다양 깨지시베 쇼를 모란가 민 바나만 깨지시베 나는 모란민 된서나 모란나 되어요 엔자랑 싱틀이야 도나 지그레스 the emotionally important 차고르와 the murder do the 되어요 엔자.
So in this way, emotion, something that's emotional and meaningful to us will break through our limited attentional resources even when we're not trying to pay attention to it. In the laboratory, we study this effect with something, with the attentional blink, which you heard about from Anne Treisman. So again, the way this paradigm works is a number of stimuli, in this case they're words, are presented very quickly. And we ask people, in this case, to tell us the words that are in green ink and ignore the ones that are in black ink. And people are pretty good at doing this, unless this second word, what we call the second target word, comes very soon after the first target word. When this happens, people often miss the second target word. And that's because noticing this word and encoding this word and attending to this word takes some resources, which are then limited.
experiment chebe kabli ya lab na misuli chiti de pangchen tenje ta chi na po impatali ya kan la mogos chende jangu yuna ni kan la sho as ta house laburwa ta nibati ni gyarang bu shabe na misu lam tugores ta nibati na rep se de ni kangbada kangpe situ da nyebur bu chi yong be na ni ya lap tugo mares. So in terms of time, temporal distance, how much?
So this is about 300, 400 milliseconds, and here we're looking at 500, 700 milliseconds.
The second chi tumbu tongda sil tambe sumja cha sumja ngapja twa. Then nangul kazu nyewa labene. So is this simply because of the attentional blink factor?
Yeah, this is the attentional blink effect. Okay. Yes, this is the same thing.
Nothing to do with the emotive content of the word.
No, it has nothing to do with the word, except what we did in this case was sometimes the second word was an emotional word, as in the word rape, and sometimes it was a neutral word. So when we did that, what we found was a pattern word. So don't feel bad if you can't see. The point I wanted to make with this, these patches vary in what we call contrast, which is the differentiation between the light and the dark shades. And contrast is a perceptual function that happens very early in visual processing. You need contrast to even detect lines. And we wanted to see... So given that we know that emotion affects processing, even in these very early visual areas, we wanted to see, does emotion influence our ability to pick up on very subtle perceptual cues like contrast? So we did an experiment, something like this. Participants looked at a cross on the screen, then they were flashed a face, and then a patch like this, and they had to tell us, are the lines tilted to the right or to the left? And we varied across trials both the emotional qualities of the face. It was either a face that had a fear expression or a face with a neutral expression, and the amount of contrast in the patches that we showed. And we determined by doing this over a number of trials how much contrast the participants needed to be able to detect the orientation of the lines when it was preceded by a fearful face or a neutral face.
No.
And what we found was something like this. When one of these patches was preceded by a fearful face, You needed much less contrast to be able to detect the orientations of the line than when it was preceded by a neutral phase.
Emotion dramatic. 미디기 통주시고래. 그 빠르게 통비 겐신.
그런 거 받아두고. 근데 그게 빠르게 동거들이야. 그 용조 담에다가 남주 통고. neutral phase 다 신앙람배 phase다. 디 통년 정원에서 그래. 근데 반응어디 용조 숙진부 옆에 동바지나 디 통배 겐제제. 아니 디 가나임제 틱도 세버시라면은 문제제 되어지.
So this tells us that perhaps the reason emotion aids attention, it's easier for us to pick up on emotional events when our attentional resources are limited, is because it's actually easier to perceive events that are in the context of emotional situations.
attention resource 미고치라줄 때고 그거다 용소식 친구들 대화 요대비 된다 중앙 강의버데 수수디도 그때가 대화 요되는 진짜 어느 코단 대화 요나 남사 미고 숙친부 때 군인식 랑싱 용요르슬랑.
All right, so emotion aids attention and perception for emotional events like this. So here is when there are neutral words. You often miss the second word in the early leg period, a little bit late when it comes later, a little bit less when it comes later on. When it's, however, an emotional word, and it could be negative or positive, what we see is we do better.
And
this is very similar to the pattern that Anne Treisman showed you with meditation. So here, just changing the emotional quality of the words instead of meditation has the same impact on the attentional blink. Okay. This is with patients with damage to the amygdala, that brain region that I showed you earlier in red. What you see is here, this is the percent of times they reported the second target word. There was no difference if the word was neutral or emotional. They failed to show this enhanced response in the intentional blink effect with damage to the amygdala. So this tells us the amygdala mediates this facilitation of attention with emotion. And when we think about how this happens, we know something about the amygdala's connectivity with the rest of the brain. So the amygdala, this region back here, is the visual cortex. And the amygdala gets information from the visual cortex very quickly and early on in sensory processing. It then feeds information back to the visual cortex, telling the visual cortex if something is emotionally significant. So if you show somebody faces with a fear expression, you will see enhanced amygdala activation. You will also see enhanced activation in early regions of the visual cortex. And if you damage the amygdala, you fail to see more amygdala activation in the visual cortex. What's interesting about this is this response we see that depends on the amygdala in the visual cortex for emotional faces occurs even in these regions in the very back that we know are necessary for simple perceptual functions. So I'm now going to demonstrate for you a simple perceptual function called contrast. I'm going to show you a little circle, and there are going to be some lines in the circle, and they're going to be tilted to the right or the left. And I would like to know if they're tilted to the right or the left. We'll ask Diego to answer. Very good. How about this one?
Right.
Good. How about that one?
Confused?
Okay.
No, it's left. Yeah.
It's left, you can see. It's very hard to see on this one on the bottom. And the reason is...
Take the yellow short or yellow short. That's every time.
Now it's clear.
Yellow short. Take two.
Yep.
Here.
Two.
Can you see?
I think the screen is very small. Because, you know.
Yeah.
Well, I tried to make it hard.
Johannes, good morning. We have today our friends from India participating. These are eminent scientists and researchers who we are for the first time being able to cordially invite and they have accepted our invitation to participate in this. You will also meet them on Saturday, more depth. So today we're going to move on to the idea.
Usually I describe myself as a messenger of ancient Indian thought. So now my real master, these are my real master. Welcome.
This morning we're gonna be looking into the effects and influence that emotions play on attention and the memory. And we are very honored that Professor Elizabeth Phelps is coming from the University of New York. She's there at the Department of Psychology and Neural Science, and her work has been groundbreaking in the investigation of how the human brain processes emotion and how that particularly affects learning, memory, and decision making. So please, Liz, it's yours.
Thank you. So, Your Holiness, before we begin, I want to say it's an honor to be able to participate in this dialogue with you today. And I want to thank you in advance for your attention and consideration. So I'm going to talk to you today about emotion and its impact on attention and memory. And just to give you a brief outline, I'm going to start just talking a little bit, very briefly, about what emotion is and why we have emotion. Then I'm going to move on to talk about emotion and its influence on attention, and then emotion and its influence on memory. And at the very end, I'll talk a little bit about how our thoughts can influence our emotions and how this might relate back to memory and attention. So I've heard a lot in this meeting so far about the destructive nature of emotion. But emotion also has some very important functions that are necessary for human survival. So in this picture here, as you can see, the fear this woman feels will motivate her to take actions to protect herself. And here's an example of a young mother looking at her infant, and the joy and love that she feels may inspire her to care for this child when it's difficult. So emotion is a signal. It tells us what's potentially relevant or important, and this can help motivate us to take appropriate actions. And because emotion is so important in how we function in the world, it should, by definition, influence our attention, memory, and our thoughts. If we look at the brain, it seems to be designed to do just this. So I'm going to talk today quite a bit about this region right here in red. It's called the amygdala. And this slide here shows a diagram of connections throughout the brain. And what this part here looks like is somewhat like, I come from the island of Manhattan in New York. This looks a little bit like Grand Central Station, which is our main train station. The amygdala is widely connected to a number of regions throughout the brain. And in a way, this allows the amygdala, when something emotional comes along, it allows the amygdala to influence the rest of the brain, to change our thoughts, our attention, and our memory. I'm going to talk today about how the amygdala does just that. So before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about what affective scientists think of when they think of emotion. Now, I think you and I and others in this room could talk for an hour or a day or maybe a month about what emotion is. I'd like to postpone that conversation until the discussion section, if we could. I just want to tell you that affective scientists, people like me who study emotion, know emotion is not one thing. There are a number of parts of an emotional response, and so I'm just going to briefly review what some of those aspects are. So usually when we use the term emotion, we're talking about our subjective feeling, what we think, how our consciousness is feeling at that time. And that's part of emotion, but it's just one component of emotion. When we have an emotional response, our body also responds. We can, for instance, increase our heart rate. We might sweat a little bit. Stress hormones will run through our body. We will also express this emotion in our face or our voice, for instance. And the emotion will motivate us to take particular actions, perhaps to approach something or withdraw from something. And another very important component of emotion, which I'm going to get to a little bit more later, is this notion of appraisal. To initiate an emotion, we have to evaluate the situation, interpret the situation, and that helps us determine what the right emotional response should be in that circumstance.
Emotion 개발해야 그 자와 간다 개인 체험도 간다 개인들은 고통 배고네 휴지 좀 가르쳐 제고도 emotion recognise 될 개고도 그 저다로 제고 간다 저바로 제고 그래서 evaluation 된단 좀 만들어 보자.
So I'm going to move on right now to talk about emotion and attention, the first topic that I'm going to cover. I'm going to make 2 points in this section. The first, emotion has two distinct roles in attention, modulating attention. One is it aids attention and perception for emotional events. At the same time, these emotional events capture our attention, so it's harder for us to observe and attend to non-emotional events. So I'm going to give you just a little example of the first